Beneath the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, a Japanese merchant convoy steams toward home, laden with vital oil, rubber, and rice from the conquered territories of Southeast Asia. On the bridge, the captain scans the horizon nervously. He knows what lurks below. Without warning, a fountain of water erupts alongside the lead tanker, then another. Within minutes, the ocean is ablaze with burning fuel, and thousands of tons of desperately needed supplies sink into the abyss. The attacker vanishes as silently as it came, leaving only wreckage and survivors clinging to debris. This was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign of underwater warfare that would prove decisive in winning World War II. This is the story of the Silent Hunters, the submarine forces that strangled the Axis powers by severing their maritime lifelines. When the world plunged into war in 1939, few military strategists fully appreciated the potential of submarine warfare. The lessons of World War I, where German U-boats had nearly brought Britain to her knees, seemed to have been forgotten or dismissed. Yet within months of the conflict's beginning, submarines would once again prove their devastating effectiveness. Unlike the thunderous spectacle of aerial bombardments or the titanic clashes of surface fleets, submarine warfare was a silent, patient, and merciless form of combat. It was fought in the crushing depths of the ocean, where men lived in cramped steel tubes, breathing recycled air and hunting prey they could not see with their naked eyes. The psychological strain was immense, the danger constant, and the results absolutely critical to the Allied victory. The Battle of the Atlantic began almost immediately after Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939. German U-boats, operating from bases along the French coast after the fall of France in 1940, prowled the vital shipping lanes between North America and Britain. Their mission was simple but devastating: sink the merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials to Britain. If Germany could sever this umbilical cord, Britain would be forced to surrender without a single Wehrmacht soldier setting foot on English soil. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, understood this perfectly. He had calculated that if his U-boats could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month consistently, Britain would collapse within a year. For several terrifying periods during the war, his U-boats came close to achieving this goal. The U-boat threat reached its peak effectiveness between 1940 and 1943, a period German submariners would later call the Happy Time. Operating in coordinated groups called wolf packs, German submarines would position themselves along the convoy routes and attack en masse, overwhelming the escorts and inflicting catastrophic losses. A single successful wolf pack attack could send dozens of ships to the bottom in a single night. The statistics from this period are staggering. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied ships, totaling more than 6 million tons of shipping. Entire convoys were virtually annihilated. Sailors who survived the initial torpedo blast faced the horror of burning oil on the water's surface, hypothermia in the frigid Atlantic, or slowly dying of thirst in lifeboats that might drift for weeks before rescue came, if it came at all. The psychological impact on merchant seamen was profound. They knew that every voyage might be their last, yet they continued to sail, driven by duty, patriotism, or simple economic necessity. But the Allies were not passive victims. British and American naval forces, along with their Canadian allies, developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The introduction of convoy systems, where merchant ships traveled in large groups protected by warships, made attacks more difficult and costly for the U-boats. Advanced sonar technology, known as ASTIC to the British and sonar to the Americans, allowed escort vessels to detect submerged submarines with increasing accuracy. Long-range patrol aircraft, including Liberator bombers equipped with radar and depth charges, closed the notorious mid-Atlantic gap, where convoys had previously sailed beyond the range of air cover. The development of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys, brought air power directly into the battle. Perhaps most critically, British intelligence achieved a monumental breakthrough by cracking the German Enigma code, allowing Allied commanders to route convoys around known U-boat positions and direct hunter-killer groups to submarine locations. By mid-1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively against Germany. In May 1943 alone, Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, losses so severe that Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. From that point forward, German submarines went from being hunters to being hunted. By war's end, Germany had lost approximately 780 U-boats and nearly 30,000 submariners out of the 40,000 who served, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of any nation's military in World War II. The Allied victory in the Atlantic was crucial because it ensured that American industrial might could reach Europe, that British citizens would not starve, and that the massive build-up for D-Day could proceed. Without victory in this silent struggle beneath the waves, the invasion of Europe and Germany's defeat would have been impossible. While the Battle of the Atlantic raged in Europe's waters, an equally important but very different submarine campaign unfolded in the vast Pacific Ocean. Here, American submarines waged a relentless war against Japanese shipping that would ultimately prove even more decisive than the Atlantic struggle. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships lay shattered in the harbor's mud. But Japan had failed to destroy the American carriers, which were at sea, and, critically, the submarine base at Pearl Harbor remained operational. In the desperate early months of the Pacific War, as Japan's forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with seemingly unstoppable momentum, American submarines represented one of the few ways the United States could strike back.
The American submarine campaign in the Pacific faced unique challenges. The vast distances involved dwarfed those of the Atlantic. Japanese home islands were thousands of miles from American bases, requiring submarines with greater range and endurance. American submarines, primarily the fleet boat-class vessels like the Gato, Balao, and Tench classes, were specifically designed for these conditions. At over 300 feet long and displacing more than 1,500 tons surfaced, they were significantly larger than German U-boats. They could patrol for 75 days, travel 11,000 miles, and dive to depths of 400 feet. They carried 24 torpedoes and had air conditioning, a seemingly minor luxury that was actually essential for preserving both crew efficiency and the delicate electronic equipment in the tropical heat. These submarines were technological marvels, but initially they carried a fatal flaw that would cost American submariners dearly in the war's first 2 years. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of American submarines, was plagued with defects that bordered on scandal. Developed in peacetime secrecy and never properly tested due to cost concerns, the Mark 14 suffered from at least 3 major problems. Its magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break its back, often triggered prematurely or not at all. The torpedoes ran approximately 10 feet deeper than their set depth, causing them to pass harmlessly beneath targets. Most frustratingly, even when torpedoes ran true and hit their targets, their contact exploders often failed because they had been designed too delicately and would crumple on impact without detonating. Submarine commanders returned from patrols with heartbreaking accounts of perfect attacks that resulted in no sinks because their torpedoes malfunctioned. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance stubbornly refused to acknowledge the problems for nearly 2 years, insisting that commanders were making errors despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It was not until mid-1943, after aggressive testing by submarine commanders themselves proved the defects conclusively, that fixes were implemented. How many Japanese ships escaped destruction and how many American lives were lost during those first 2 years due to defective torpedoes remains a tragic question. Once the torpedo problems were resolved, American submarines became the most lethal submarine force in history. Operating from bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and later from captured bases in the Philippines, American submarines waged unrestricted warfare against Japanese shipping. Unlike the Atlantic, where German U-boats primarily targeted Allied merchant vessels and the Allies protected those convoys, in the Pacific, American submarines hunted everything Japanese: tankers, cargo ships, troop transports, and warships alike. Japan's empire, stretching from the home islands through Korea, China, Southeast Asia, and across the Pacific Islands, depended absolutely on maritime transportation. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from the Philippines, and countless other resources had to be shipped to Japan's industrial centers for processing and then distributed to Japanese military forces scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. Without these supplies, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt. American submarine commanders understood this, and they set about systematically destroying Japan's merchant fleet with ruthless efficiency. The statistics of the American submarine campaign are devastating in their totality. American submarines sank approximately 1,400 Japanese merchant ships, totaling about 5.3 million tons of shipping, which represented roughly 55% of all Japanese merchant losses during the war. They also sank 214 Japanese warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. These numbers, impressive as they are, failed to capture the campaign's true strategic impact. By 1944, Japan's oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, essential for fueling its Navy and Air Force, had been reduced to a trickle. Critical resources never reached Japanese factories. Industrial production plummeted. Japanese forces in remote garrisons faced starvation because supply ships never arrived. The Japanese Navy, built around a doctrine of decisive fleet engagement, found itself unable to sortie because it lacked fuel. By war's end, Japan's merchant marine had been virtually annihilated, reduced from approximately 6 million tons at the war's start to barely 500,000 tons, much of that damaged or stranded in isolated ports. Life aboard an American submarine on war patrol combined boredom, discomfort, and moments of sheer terror. A typical patrol lasted 2 months, with weeks spent traversing empty ocean before reaching assigned patrol areas off Japan's coasts, along major shipping routes, or near strategic islands. Once on station, the submarine would spend days or even weeks hunting, often finding nothing. Contact with an enemy ship would trigger a carefully orchestrated ballet of approach, calculation, and attack. The submarine would track its target, usually on the surface at night when submarines were fastest and hardest to detect. As the range closed, the submarine would dive and approach using sonar and periscope observations. The captain, eyes pressed to the periscope for mere seconds at a time to avoid detection, would call out target bearing, speed, and angle. The torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog computer that was one of World War II's secret weapons, would calculate the firing solution. Then came the order: Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. Torpedoes would leave their tubes with a distinctive lurch felt throughout the boat. Long seconds would pass as torpedoes ran towards their target at 46 knots. Then, if all went well, the underwater shockwave and distinctive sound of explosions would reverberate through the submarine's hull. But this was also the moment of greatest danger. Japanese escorts, particularly as the war progressed and Japan developed more effective anti-submarine tactics, would immediately counterattack. Depth charges, drum-shaped explosive devices set to detonate at specific depths, would rain down on the submarine's position. The submarine would dive deep, rig for silent running with all non-essential equipment shut down, and attempt to evade. Depth charge attacks were psychologically devastating. The submarine crew, helpless to fight back, could only wait in the dark as explosions thundered around them. Each blast felt like being inside a steel drum struck by a massive hammer. Close explosions would knock men off their feet, shatter light bulbs, cause leaks, and damage equipment. The terror was compounded by knowing that a single breach in the pressure hull meant death for everyone aboard. Some attacks lasted hours, with dozens or even hundreds of depth charges dropped. Through it all, submariners had to maintain absolute silence because Japanese escorts listened for any sound that would reveal the submarine's position. Men communicated through hand signals and whispers. Even walking was done with extreme care. The human cost of submarine warfare was profound on all sides. Submariners were volunteers who understood the risks. They received extra pay and better food than other servicemen, but no amount of compensation could truly balance the psychological weight of their service. American submariners, despite operating with generally superior technology and training, still faced significant losses. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, taking with them more than 3,500 men. The survival rate when a submarine was lost was virtually zero. If a submarine was depth-charged to destruction, all hands died almost instantly either from the explosions, crushing water pressure, or drowning. If a submarine was damaged and forced to surface in enemy waters, the crew faced capture and often brutal treatment as prisoners of war. The silent service, as submariners called themselves, suffered a casualty rate second only to the German U-boat force among all American military branches.
British submarines, often overshadowed by their American counterparts in Pacific narratives and German U-boats in Atlantic histories, nevertheless made crucial contributions to Allied victory. In the Mediterranean, British submarines operated from bases in Malta, Gibraltar, and Alexandria, interdicting Axis supply lines to North Africa. During the critical periods when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps battled British forces in the Western Desert, his greatest enemy was not the British Eighth Army, but the British submarines and aircraft that sank the tankers carrying fuel and the cargo ships carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements from Italy to North African ports. Rommel repeatedly had to halt offensives or retreat, not because of battlefield defeats, but because his supplies never arrived. British submarine operations in the Mediterranean were particularly hazardous because the sea is relatively shallow, very clear, and during much of the war, both shores were controlled by hostile forces. British submarines operated in what amounted to an Axis lake, with limited areas for concealment and constant aerial surveillance. Despite these challenges, British submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Axis shipping, directly contributing to the eventual Allied victory in North Africa. British submarines also operated extensively in northern European waters, laying minefields, landing agents and commandos, gathering intelligence, and attacking German shipping along the Norwegian coast and in the Baltic Sea. One of the most remarkable British submarine operations occurred in September 1943 when the midget submarine X-Craft attacked the German battleship Tirpitz in a Norwegian fjord. 4 midget submarines, each crewed by 4 men and carried to Norwegian waters by conventional submarines, attempted to penetrate the fjord's defenses, navigate beneath anti-submarine nets, and place massive explosive charges beneath Tirpitz. 2 midget submarines successfully placed their charges and seriously damaged Tirpitz, putting her out of action for months. The crews were captured, but their courage earned them Victoria Crosses. This operation exemplified the ingenuity and bravery that characterized British submarine operations throughout the war. Soviet submarines also played a role in the war, though their effectiveness was limited by several factors. The Soviet submarine fleet was substantial, numbering over 200 boats at various points during the war, but Soviet submariners suffered from inadequate training, outdated tactics, and technological deficiencies compared to Western submarines. Operating primarily in the Baltic and Arctic seas, Soviet submarines faced German anti-submarine forces that had been honed by years of Atlantic combat. Nevertheless, Soviet submarines did score successes, particularly in the Baltic, where they sank German merchant ships carrying iron ore from Sweden and troops and supplies to German forces on the Eastern Front. The most notorious Soviet submarine success was also a tragedy: the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff in January 1945, a German ship evacuating refugees and wounded soldiers from East Prussia as Soviet forces advanced. Over 9,000 people died, making it the worst maritime disaster in history. While Soviet submarines contributed to the Allied effort, their impact was relatively minor compared to American and British operations. The technological evolution of submarines during World War II was remarkable. At the war's beginning, submarines were essentially surface ships that could submerge temporarily. They spent most of their time on the surface, using diesel engines for propulsion and battery-powered electric motors only when submerged. By war's end, true submarine technology was emerging. Germany developed the Type 21 U-boat, the first true submarine designed to operate primarily underwater. It had a streamlined hull for underwater speed, massive battery capacity allowing it to remain submerged for days, and a snorkel system that allowed diesel engines to run while at periscope depth, recharging batteries without fully surfacing. Though only a few Type 21 boats became operational before war's end, and none achieved combat success, their design influenced all post-war submarine development. Similarly, Germany developed the Walter turbine, a hydrogen peroxide-powered engine that allowed high-speed underwater propulsion, though it proved too dangerous and unreliable for operational use. These late-war German innovations, born of desperation, pointed toward the future of submarine warfare, even as Germany's defeat rendered them irrelevant to World War II's outcome. The strategic implications of Allied submarine success extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The American submarine campaign against Japan demonstrated that sea power could decisively defeat a major industrial nation without requiring invasion. Japan's surrender in August 1945 resulted from multiple factors, including the atomic bombs, Soviet entry into the war, and the cumulative effect of conventional bombing. However, the submarine blockade had already effectively defeated Japan economically. Even without atomic weapons or invasion, Japan could not have continued the war indefinitely because it lacked the fuel, food, and raw materials necessary to sustain its population and military. This lesson influenced post-war strategic thinking about naval power and blockade strategies. As the war drew to its conclusion, the toll of submarine warfare on all sides became clear. Beyond the ships sunk and battles won, submarine warfare had claimed tens of thousands of lives. Submariners who died in their steel coffins beneath the waves, merchant seamen who perished in the cold Atlantic or warm Pacific waters, and naval personnel aboard warships that never saw their underwater attackers. The psychological scars affected survivors for decades. Submarine veterans often struggled with nightmares, claustrophobia, and survivor's guilt. Merchant seamen who survived multiple sinkings faced the impossible choice of continuing to sail or abandoning their livelihood and their duty. The legacy of World War II submarine warfare shaped the post-war world in fundamental ways. The atmosphere of naval discipline and precision depicted by pieces like Gems and Norvège contrasted starkly with the technological evolution shown in warping. The Cold War submarine forces of both the United States and Soviet Union were built on lessons learned in World War II, refined and amplified by nuclear propulsion and ballistic missiles. The submarine veterans who had hunted Axis shipping became the leaders who developed submarine doctrine for a new age. The industrial capacity that built thousands of war-winning submarines was repurposed for Cold War defense production. The alliance of democratic nations that had cooperated to defeat submarine threats in World War II evolved into NATO's anti-submarine warfare capabilities.
The silent hunters of World War II proved that wars could be won in the depths as well as on the surface. They demonstrated that cutting an enemy's supply lines could be as decisive as destroying their armies in battle. They showed that technology, courage, and strategic vision could triumph even in the most hostile environment on Earth. The submariners who sailed beneath the waves, whether American, British, German, or Japanese, shared a unique brotherhood born of facing death in the crushing depths. Their service reminds us that victory in war often depends not on the dramatic battles that capture headlines and imaginations, but on the patient, dangerous, unglamorous work of strangling an enemy's ability to sustain the fight. In the end, the silent hunters crippled the Axis powers by doing what submarines do best: striking unseen, disappearing without trace, and returning again and again until the enemy could no longer sail the seas safely. Their contribution to Allied victory was as profound as any army's campaign or Air Force's bombing offensive, and their story deserves to be remembered as one of World War II's decisive campaigns. The human dimension of submarine warfare extended far beyond the combatants, touching the lives of millions who depended on the outcome of this invisible struggle. In Britain, housewives queued for rationed food that arrived only because convoy escorts and anti-submarine aircraft kept the U-boats at bay.
Children grew up never knowing the taste of oranges or bananas because tropical fruit ships became priority targets for German submarines. The British government implemented strict rationing, not out of ideological preference, but from desperate necessity, as German torpedoes sent butter, meat, sugar, and grain to the ocean floor. Every British citizen understood that their survival depended on ships reaching port safely. When convoys were decimated, the impact rippled through every aspect of British life. When convoys got through, the nation breathed easier. The submarine war was not an abstract strategic contest, but a struggle for Britain's very existence. In Japan, the impact of American submarine operations became increasingly catastrophic as the war progressed. By 1944, Japanese civilians faced growing shortages of everything from rice to coal for heating. Factories shut down or operated at reduced capacity because raw materials never arrived. The Japanese government imposed draconian rationing and exhorted citizens to accept hardship for the war effort. But no amount of patriotic fervor could conjure resources from empty warehouses. Japanese soldiers in remote Pacific garrisons, cut off by American submarines that sank their supply ships, faced starvation. On islands like New Guinea, Bougainville, and throughout the Solomon Islands chain, Japanese troops resorted to eating grass, roots, and bark. Disease killed more Japanese soldiers than combat in many isolated garrisons. American submarine commanders reading intelligence reports about Japanese forces starving on bypassed islands understood they were waging a form of siege warfare on a massive scale. The ethical dimensions of this were complex. Submariners were fighting a war they had not started, against an enemy that had attacked without warning at Pearl Harbor and committed numerous atrocities throughout Asia. Yet the human cost of slowly starving entire garrisons troubled some submarine veterans long after the war ended. The intelligence war that paralleled submarine operations was equally critical to the outcome. The breaking of German Enigma codes by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, aided by captured Enigma machines and codebooks from U-boats, gave the Allies an invaluable advantage. Reading German naval communications allowed Allied commanders to route convoys around known U-boat positions, concentrate anti-submarine forces where German submarines were operating, and ambush U-boats when they surfaced to recharge batteries or receive orders. The Germans never realized their codes had been comprehensively broken, attributing their increasing losses to improved Allied technology and tactics rather than compromised communications. Similarly, American cryptanalysts broke Japanese naval codes, providing submarine commanders with advanced warning of Japanese ship movements. Many of the most successful American submarine patrols resulted from intelligence directing submarines to intercept specific convoys or warships. This marriage of intelligence and operations represented a revolution in naval warfare that would only grow in importance in subsequent decades. The technology race between submarines and anti-submarine forces drove innovation at an unprecedented pace. Early in the war, submarines held the advantage. They could approach convoys underwater, attack, and escape before effective counterattacks could be organized. But each advantage was eventually countered. When Allied aircraft began using radar to detect surfaced U-boats at night, Germany developed radar warning receivers that alerted submarines when they were being painted by radar. The Allies responded with centimetric radar operating on wavelengths that German receivers could not detect. Germany then covered U-boats with radar-absorbent material, the first stealth technology, though with limited effectiveness. When Allied sonar became more accurate, submarines developed tactics of diving deep below the thermocline layer, where temperature differences bent sonar waves, making detection more difficult. The Allies countered by developing variable depth sonar that could be lowered below the thermocline. This action-reaction cycle accelerated throughout the war, with each side desperately trying to gain even a marginal advantage. One of the most effective Allied technologies was also one of the simplest, the Lee light. This powerful searchlight mounted on aircraft allowed planes to illuminate submarines detected by radar during the final moments of attack approach. Before the Lee light, submarines detected by radar at night could crash dive and escape before the aircraft completed its attack run. The sudden illumination by the Lee light caught submarines on the surface, giving aircrews precious seconds to line up their depth charge attacks. German submarines, caught in the blazing light with aircraft roaring overhead, had no chance to escape. The psychological impact was severe. U-boat crews learned to dread night surfacing in the Bay of Biscay, where British aircraft equipped with Lee lights prowled constantly. The Bay of Biscay became known as the Valley of Death among German submariners. The acoustic torpedo represented another significant technological leap. Traditional torpedoes ran on preset courses calculated to intercept the target's predicted position. They were dumb weapons that could miss if calculations were wrong or if targets maneuvered. German T5 Zaunkönig acoustic torpedoes, introduced in 1943, had acoustic homing systems that guided them toward propeller noise, specifically targeting escort vessels. Early success rates were impressive, but the Allies quickly developed countermeasures. The Foxer, a noise-making device towed behind ships, created false targets that lured acoustic torpedoes away from their intended victims. Americans developed similar acoustic torpedoes for submarine use, and Japanese shipping losses increased as homing torpedoes proved devastatingly effective against zigzagging targets that might have evaded straight-running torpedoes.
Training for submarine warfare evolved dramatically during the conflict. Early in the war, submarine crews on all sides often deployed with minimal training, learning critical skills through trial and error that cost lives. As the war progressed, all combatant nations developed sophisticated training programs. American submarine training included extensive work in attack simulators, where officers practiced approaches and attacks against simulated targets. Crews trained in escape procedures from sunken submarines, using escape towers that simulated depths of 100 feet or more. Medical personnel trained to handle the unique injuries and emergencies that occurred aboard submarines. The psychological screening of submarine volunteers became more rigorous as the services learned that certain personality types adapted better to the confined, tense environment of submarine duty. German U-boat training emphasized aggression and night surface attacks. British training focused on operating in shallow, hostile waters where stealth and patience were paramount. Japanese submarine training, focused initially on attacking warships rather than merchant vessels, proved inadequate for the commerce rating that Japan desperately needed but never effectively implemented. Japanese submarine doctrine represented one of the war's great strategic failures. Japan possessed excellent submarines with long-range and heavy torpedo armament. Japanese submarine crews were skilled and brave. Yet Japan's submarine force failed to significantly impact the American war effort because Japanese naval doctrine emphasized using submarines primarily against warships rather than merchant shipping. Japanese submarines were assigned to fleet support roles, scouting for American carriers and waiting to attack major warships. This meant Japanese submarines often ignored the abundant merchant shipping targets that American submarines hunted so effectively. When Japan finally recognized the need to target American supply lines, it was too late. American anti-submarine forces had become highly effective, and Japanese submarines attempting commerce raiding were hunted down ruthlessly. Japan's failure to wage effective submarine warfare against American logistics represented a massive strategic blunder that contributed significantly to Japan's defeat. The contrast between American and Japanese submarine doctrine illustrates broader cultural and strategic differences. American naval leadership, once freed from peacetime constraints by Pearl Harbor, immediately authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Every Japanese vessel became a target. American submarines conducted war patrols that lasted months, operating independently with broad authority to attack targets of opportunity. Submarine commanders were encouraged to be aggressive, take calculated risks, and exploit situations as they developed. This approach aligned with American industrial advantages and democratic military culture that empowered junior leaders.
Japanese doctrine, by contrast, reflected a battleship-centric naval philosophy inherited from pre-war planning and a cultural preference for decisive fleet engagements over grinding attrition warfare. Japanese submarines were treated as auxiliary units supporting the surface fleet rather than as independent strategic weapons. This philosophical difference had profound consequences. The end of World War II brought the submarine war to an abrupt conclusion, but the legacy endured. Germany's surrender in May 1945 came after the Battle of the Atlantic had been decisively won. Surviving U-boats received orders to surface, hoist black flags, and proceed to designated Allied ports for surrender. Some U-boat commanders refused, scuttling their boats rather than surrender. A few attempted to reach Argentina or other neutral nations, with mixed success. The vast majority complied, and Allied forces took possession of dozens of U-boats, including advanced Type 21 boats. These submarines were extensively studied by American, British, and Soviet naval experts, profoundly influencing post-war submarine development. Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended the Pacific submarine campaign at a point when American submarines had essentially completed their mission of destroying Japan's merchant marine. Japanese submarines that survived to war's end were in poor condition, with inadequate fuel and limited operational capability. The immediate post-war period saw submarine forces drastically reduced. Thousands of submarines were scrapped or sunk in deep water to prevent their falling into potentially hostile hands. Submarine crews demobilized and returned to civilian life, carrying with them memories and traumas that many would never fully share. The submarine bases that had hummed with activity fell quiet. But the knowledge, technology, and tactical doctrine developed during the war did not disappear. Instead, it formed the foundation for Cold War submarine forces that would become even more important strategically than their World War II predecessors. The human cost of submarine warfare was memorialized in various ways. Submarine memorials were erected in ports and cities around the world. The USS Baufen in Pearl Harbor, HMS Alliance at Gosport, and U-995 in Germany were preserved as museum ships, allowing future generations to experience the cramped conditions submariners endured. Annual reunions of submarine veterans became important events where survivors could share experiences with those who understood. But many submarine veterans remained silent about their service, finding it too difficult or too painful to discuss. The submariners who never returned home were remembered in special services where their sacrifice was honored. Families who lost fathers, brothers, and sons to the depths found what comfort they could in knowing their loved ones had served with distinction. The strategic lessons of World War II submarine warfare influenced military thinking for generations. The importance of protecting sea lines of communication became axiomatic. The potential for submarines to wage war against commerce was definitively proven. The value of intelligence in directing submarine operations was established beyond question. The necessity of persistent anti-submarine warfare capabilities was recognized by all naval powers. These lessons shaped Cold War naval forces and continue to influence maritime strategy in the 21st century. Modern submarines armed with cruise missiles and nuclear torpedoes represent an evolution of World War II concepts, made vastly more capable by nuclear propulsion and advanced electronics, but fundamentally rooted in the same operational principles. As we reflect on the submarine campaigns of World War II from the perspective of the present day, what stands out most clearly is the decisive nature of this form of warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic and the American submarine campaign against Japan were not sideshows or supporting efforts. They were central to Allied victory. Germany and Japan were defeated not only on battlefields, but in the oceanic depths where their supply lines were systematically destroyed. The silent hunters operating far from public view, waging a patient, dangerous campaign beneath the waves, achieved victories as important as any won by armies or air forces. Their service reminds us that modern war is total war, encompassing not just military forces, but entire economies and logistic systems. Victory belongs to those who can sustain their war effort while denying the enemy the resources to sustain theirs. The submariners of World War II, whether they wore American, British, German, Japanese, or Soviet uniforms, shared a unique experience of warfare unlike any other. They fought in an environment that was simultaneously claustrophobic and vast, where death could come instantly from death charges or slowly from suffocation or drowning. They hunted invisible enemies and were hunted in turn by foes they rarely saw. They lived for weeks in cramped steel tubes, breathing foul air, eating monotonous food, and sleeping in shifts in bunks still warm from the previous occupant. They faced dangers both from the enemy and from the sea itself, which was always trying to crush their fragile hull or swallow it whole. Through it all, they maintained discipline, courage, and commitment to their mission. The silent hunters of World War II crippled the Axis supply lines so thoroughly that economic collapse became inevitable even before military defeat was complete. They proved that sea power, properly applied through submarine warfare, could strangle nations and decide the outcome of global conflicts. They demonstrated that technology, tactics, and human courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, and they paid a terrible price for their victories, with casualty rates among the highest of any military branch. Their story is one of both strategic brilliance and human tragedy, of decisive victory and profound sacrifice. As the last veterans of World War II's submarine service pass from living memory into history, their achievements stand as testament to what can be accomplished when skilled warriors employ innovative technology in pursuit of clear strategic objectives. The silent hunters won their war in the depths, and in doing so, they helped win the greatest conflict humanity has ever known.